In 1972, a plane carrying 45 passengers crashed amidst the towering snow-covered Andes Mountains. A miraculous group of survivors emerged, but their greatest challenge lay ahead: surviving the harsh conditions of this remote, frozen landscape. The bone-chilling cold, lack of life, and absence of food created an almost impossible situation. The small amount of food on the plane was quickly consumed, leaving the survivors with a harrowing decision. They had to eat the bodies of those who had perished to stay alive. The circumstances and trials faced by these passengers were beyond imagination. Despite the unimaginable hardships, they clung to hope and fought for survival. Would they make it out alive, or was this their final journey? Welcome to today's story, one of survival, filled with harrowing events and extreme challenges faced by those involved. The events of our story begin in October 1972. The main characters are a rugby team from Uruguay, a sport somewhat similar to American football. Most of the team members were university students in their early 20s. They were invited to a match in Chile, another South American country. As seen on the map, they needed to travel from Uruguay to Chile, which meant flying over Argentina and the Andes Mountains. The trip was supposed to be a short 4-day journey, departing Thursday and returning Monday. Given their limited budget, the team rented an affordable aircraft, a Fairchild FH-227 that could seat about 50 people. Once the team provided their passenger list, the captain informed them there were 10 extra seats available, allowing them to bring friends or family members. Some players brought relatives, raising the total number of passengers to 45, including the pilots and crew. Among the passengers was Nando Paradu, a key figure in our story. He brought along his mother and sister, imagining a joyful trip to Chile where they could bond and enjoy themselves. Little did he know the horrors that awaited. On Thursday, October 12, 1972, their flight departed from Montevideo, Uruguay, bound for Santiago, Chile. However, weather conditions forced the pilot to land in Mendoza, Argentina, at the foot of the Andes Mountains. They spent the night there and resumed their journey the next morning, Friday, October 13th, a date considered unlucky in Western culture. The aircraft, a Fairchild FH-227, was notorious for its weak engines, making it risky for high-altitude flights. Despite this, the team embarked optimistically, unaware of the danger ahead. As they flew southward along the Andes, the pilot planned to cross the mountains through a low pass before heading north to Santiago. The passengers were in high spirits, singing and enjoying themselves. Among them, Nando switched seats with his friend who wanted a better view. This seemingly insignificant moment would later determine who lived and who died. At 3:25 p.m., the pilot mistakenly reported that they had reached Curacao, Chile, even though they were still over the Andes Mountains. Believing they had cleared the mountains, the pilot turned north, not realizing they were heading deeper into the range. Limited visibility and severe turbulence created a deadly situation. As the plane descended below the clouds, the pilots and passengers were horrified to see the towering mountains all around them. The pilots attempted to gain altitude, but the aircraft's engines were too weak. Moments later, the plane struck the mountainside and its tail and wings broke off. The fuselage slid down the snowy slope, with passengers inside enduring unimaginable chaos. Seats were ripped from their positions and bodies collided violently. Miraculously, the front section of the plane remained relatively intact. Out of the 45 passengers, 12 died in the initial crash. Among the 33 survivors, many were severely injured. The survivors, shaken and disoriented, emerged from the wreckage to confront the reality of their situation. Stranded at 3,600 meters, 11,800 feet, amidst a desolate, frozen wasteland. Nando was unconscious, and his fellow survivors were unsure if he was alive. They moved his body to the edge of the plane to make space for others. His mother had died instantly and his sister was critically injured. As the freezing night fell, the survivors huddled together, beginning a harrowing ordeal that would test the limits of human endurance. The avalanche left the survivors in an even more desperate situation. Those who could move started digging through the snow with their bare hands to rescue their buried companions. The scene was pure chaos. Some were partially trapped, while others were completely buried beneath tons of freezing snow. The bitter cold made it almost impossible to dig, and time was running out for those suffocating beneath the snow. Screams for help echoed through the frozen wreckage, but not all could be saved. By the time the chaos subsided, 8 more survivors had perished, leaving the group devastated and their numbers dwindling to just 19. In the days that followed, the group was forced to adapt to their worsening circumstances. The avalanche had sealed off the entrance to the plane's fuselage, turning it into a dark, claustrophobic space with limited oxygen. They had to dig a small hole to let in air and light. Despite their efforts to create a livable space, the conditions were dire. Their reliance on the remains of their companions for sustenance became a grim but necessary routine. Though the decision had initially caused deep moral and emotional distress, survival instincts overpowered hesitation. The cold temperatures preserved the bodies, preventing decay, but the psychological toll of their actions weighed heavily on them. Each day, the survivors clung to the hope that rescue teams would find them. They spent hours scanning the skies for planes, hoping against hope that someone would spot them amidst the endless white expanse. On occasion, they would hear the faint sound of aircraft engines in the distance, but their attempts to signal for help were futile. The avalanche had buried any visible signs of their location, making them even harder to detect. By the 24th day, desperation turned to determination. Nando Paradu, who had miraculously survived his head injury, and Roberto Canessa, a medical student, proposed a daring plan: to trek across the treacherous Andes Mountains in search of help. It was a seemingly impossible mission, but they knew that staying in the wreckage meant certain death. With limited supplies and makeshift gear, they prepared for the journey. Using insulation from the plane and materials scavenged from the wreckage, they crafted crude sleeping bags and snowshoes. They knew the trek would be grueling, but they were driven by a singular goal: to save their friends. On December 12th, after weeks of preparation, Nando, Roberto, and another survivor, Antonio Vizintin, set out on their perilous journey. The rest of the group remained behind, praying for their success. The trek through the Andes was a harrowing ordeal. The 3 men faced freezing temperatures, blinding snow, and treacherous terrain. At night, they huddled together for warmth, using their makeshift sleeping bags to stave off hypothermia. By day, they climbed sheer cliffs and navigated endless expanses of snow, their determination the only thing keeping them moving. After 3 days, they realized their supplies wouldn't last the entire journey. In a heartbreaking decision, they sent Antonio back to the fuselage to conserve food and give Nando and Roberto a better chance of success. Now a duo, the men pressed on, their resolve unshaken despite the immense challenges. On December 20th, after 10 days of relentless trekking, Nando and Roberto finally descended into the foothills of the Andes. Exhausted and near collapse, they stumbled upon a Chilean farmer who alerted authorities. The news spread quickly: the survivors of the crash had been found. Rescue teams mobilized immediately, braving the harsh conditions to reach the remaining survivors. On December 23rd, after 72 days stranded in the mountains, the 16 remaining survivors were finally rescued. Their ordeal had been one of unimaginable suffering, but also of extraordinary resilience and determination. The group's leader, Nando Paradu, along with Roberto and Antonio, undertook a pivotal journey in search of rescue. After multiple failed attempts and crushing setbacks, including the inability to repair the airplane radio, they resolved to leave the safety of the wreckage and venture into the unknown. This decision was driven by the realization that remaining in place offered no hope of salvation. Before setting out, the survivors prepared extensively, pooling their scarce resources to equip the trio for their journey. They allocated larger portions of food, gathered insulating materials, and crafted a durable sleeping bag to withstand the freezing nights in the mountains. Every member contributed to the effort, demonstrating unity and determination. The villages on the Chilean side knew that climbing this mountain alone would require at least a full day. So they started ascending, and of course, it was a grueling and exhausting process. Climbing at such an incline is extremely difficult, and on top of that they had no prior experience or training in mountain climbing. At these heights, even breathing was hard because the oxygen level in the air was lower. The more they moved and exerted themselves, the more oxygen they needed, but due to the lack of oxygen, breathing became harder and harder. With every step they took, they always faced the danger of slipping. They tried to hold on to something, but it was impossible. Every step they took forward, they slipped half a step backward. They then tried to climb the rocky parts, which by themselves required immense strength and high fitness. Sometimes the rocks would fall on them. Perhaps one of the things that helped them was that they had lost a lot of weight. Each of them had lost around 30 or 40 kilograms. Finally, after all the effort they put in, they reached the summit, or so they thought. The peak in front of them was a type of false summit, meaning it looked like the peak of the mountain from below, but when they reached it, they realized it was a false summit and there was an even higher peak ahead of them that they had to climb to reach the real summit. This shattered their spirits when they reached this false summit, but at least this place was suitable for camping for the night. So they spent the night huddled together using the sleeping bag their friends had made for them. The cold was harsh, but at least the sleeping bag kept them alive. The next day, the three continued their exhausting climb. Of course, their friends down by the plane wreckage could still see them from afar as small dots, though they were still within their line of sight. After climbing even higher, Roberto noticed something that looked like a road or path from afar, but it was on the eastern side, the opposite direction to them. He pointed it out to his friends and asked them if they could see it, but Nando said he couldn't see any road, and Antonio said the same thing. But Roberto insisted that it was a road and even argued with Nando, saying it would be better for them to descend the mountain and head toward this road in the east. Of course, Nando firmly rejected this idea, saying that they had already climbed so much distance to go back down. Indeed, what Roberto saw was a path used by people, but it was on the eastern side and they could have reached it if they headed east. However, by now they were far from it and they still believed they were closer to the west. So they decided to continue their journey westward and keep climbing. The climb was extremely exhausting and took much longer than they had calculated. They thought they would need just one day to reach the summit, but due to the false summit and the path being harder than expected, it took them 3 days. The hope that kept them going was that they would see the green valleys and villages or towns on the western side. That was always their hope, that once they reached the summit they would see these things. But the biggest shock came when they finally reached the summit and saw nothing but snow-covered mountains stretching before them as far as the eye could see. There were no fields, no green valleys, no towns, no villages, and no signs of life. The despair they felt at that moment was indescribable. After all this effort and hardship, the result was nothing. Nando, despite feeling all this despair, turned to his friend Roberto and said, "Let's keep going. Whatever happens, either we'll reach safety or we'll die trying." Roberto, though he was at his lowest point when he saw Nando speaking like that, felt a surge of energy return to him. He said, "You're right, my friend. We've come this far, let's keep going whatever happens. We either live together or die together." At this point, Nando decided that having 3 of them was slowing their progress, and their food and supplies had significantly decreased. So he told their third companion Antonio to go back, give them whatever food he had left, and return to the plane while he and Roberto would continue alone. Antonio agreed, gave them the remaining supplies and descended the mountain. The descent was much faster, taking only a few hours. When Antonio reached the plane wreckage, his friends saw him and went to him. He informed them of what had happened and that after reaching the summit, they had only seen snow-covered mountains stretching before them. He told them that Nando and Roberto had taken the remaining supplies and decided to continue alone, undeterred by anything except death. Nando and Roberto kept walking westward. They descended the mountain they had reached the summit of but took the route on the other side. There was a path running through the mountains and they decided to take it. The surrounding mountains were tall, but fortunately this time they didn't have to climb any of the big peaks. They were trying to take the paths and valleys between the mountains. Sometimes they had to climb small hills or minor peaks, but they didn't have to climb high mountains like the first one. With the vastness of the place they were in, it was hard to gauge the distance. They had no sense of how far they had traveled or how much more they had left to go. Perhaps this was a blessing in disguise, as knowing the distance would have made them feel hopeless. All they were focused on was moving forward, and this surely helped them mentally. Their tough journey continued between the mountains for 10 more days, starting from the moment they left their friends by the plane wreckage. But finally, after these 10 days, they reached the line that symbolized their salvation, the line where the snow ended and life began. At that moment it felt like a new life for them. The joy and happiness they felt were impossible to describe. They started walking through the green valleys they had dreamed of for the past 10 days. Finally, they felt like they had truly come back to life. On their way, they even saw a cow and they began telling themselves that there must be people nearby. They were still in the wilderness and hadn't seen anyone yet, but they felt they were getting close, seeing trees, grass, flowers, and even water. Nando and Roberto said that at that moment, it felt like they had entered a 5-star hotel. The weather was nice, there was water, and they even had grass to eat. They felt that the simple things we take for granted in our daily lives were the greatest things in the world. During these 10 days, Nando and Roberto had walked more than 60 kilometers before they reached the place they were now. But even after reaching these green valleys, they spent one last night in the wilderness. The next morning they continued on their way and reached a river. The surprise came when they saw a man on a horse on the opposite bank. They started shouting at him and signaling, but communication was difficult because the river was large, and the sound of the rushing water was loud, so they couldn't hear each other. The man on the horse was also surprised to see people up there on the mountains, as they were still above the mountains even though they had descended. Nando and Roberto had no choice but to cross the river to reach him, but the strength of the current would have swept them away. The man on the other side had an idea. He took a piece of paper and pen, tied them to a rock, and threw them across the river to Nando and Roberto. Nando grabbed the paper and pen and immediately wrote a message explaining their situation. This is the actual image of the message Nando wrote. It said, "We are coming from a plane that crashed between the mountains. We are from Uruguay and we've been walking for days. There are still 14 injured people at the plane wreck waiting for rescue. We have no food and we need help urgently. Please help us, we can't even walk." Nando threw the message back across the river, and the man appeared shocked as he read it. After reading it carefully 2 or 3 times, he signaled to Nando that he understood the situation and indicated that they should stay where they were, and he would bring help. Before he left, he threw a piece of bread and cheese to Nando and Roberto. This bread and cheese were the first food they had eaten that wasn't human flesh in the past 2 months. The man on the horse took several hours to bring the help. The place they were in was still far from civilization. Finally, the man returned with soldiers and the soldiers were able to rescue Nando and Roberto. These are actual footage of their rescue and discovery for the first time. Their condition was pitiful, and their appearances showed the exhaustion and suffering they had endured. The pictures were taken by journalists who arrived as soon as the news reached them. They came from nowhere to the peaks of the mountains. In the picture we see Roberto on the right, Nando on the left, and the man on the horse who could be considered their savior named Sergio Catlon. Imagine, the journalists didn't even give them time to catch their breath. They immediately started interviewing them. One of the journalists even asked how they survived for all this time and what they had been eating. Roberto was about to answer, but Nando interrupted and told the journalist that they wouldn't answer this question. The journalists, frankly, shouldn't have bothered them at all. These two had literally just emerged from hell, and they should have been given a chance to rest. The journalists should have focused on rescuing the remaining survivors at the plane wreckage. What happened to them finally, and here we see real video footage of the plane wreckage. All of Nando's companions, the 14 remaining ones at the wreckage, were rescued. I'm sure none of them will ever forget that day, which was on December 22, 1972, the day of their rescue. And subhanallah, the number of days they spent from the moment the plane crashed until they were rescued is the same as the year they were in. 72 days from the crash until the remaining 14 survivors, along with Nando, were safely brought to safety. Their condition, of course, was very poor. Each one of them had lost 30 to 40 kilograms, but the joy was clear on their faces. After that, their names were announced on the radio so their families would know who survived. A short time later they met their families and they were reunited once again. The story spread and the media covered it worldwide, becoming a global story. However, many articles began to surface in newspapers talking about their survival by eating the bodies of their companions, because this part of the story spread, and it may have been one of the reasons why people were so drawn to it. I mean, when you hear that they survived by eating their friends, it shocks you. Some of these articles even started criticizing them and calling them cannibals, leading to a big controversy on the topic. There were debates among people asking whether, if we were in their place, we would have done the same. In the end, if they hadn't eaten their companions, they would never have survived. This is one of the most famous survival stories that spread worldwide. Books have been written about it and numerous films and documentaries have been made about it. Nando and his companions appeared in many interviews and events, telling their story in full detail. This was one of the biggest stories adopted by the media due to its strength, strangeness, and perhaps also because of its somewhat happy ending. The 16 survivors continued to meet over the years, holding a gathering every year on the same date they were rescued, December 22nd. By the way, everything we've said about Nando, especially since he was the leader of the flight without dispute, all of this was from the testimony of his companions. He didn't speak about himself saying, "I was the leader and I saved them," or "I did everything." They all knew that the greatest credit after Allah for their survival was Nando's determination to survive until the very last moment, no matter the circumstances. Nando, who at the beginning of the crash was considered dead and remained unconscious for 3 days due to a brain injury, his survival from this was truly miraculous in itself. Nando and Roberto still stay in touch and meet with the man on horseback who helped them after they came down from the Andes Mountains. Their relationship with him remains strong and they are still friends to this day. At the end of the story, it's impossible to fully comprehend the conditions these people lived through in those mountains. No matter how much we try to imagine and put ourselves in their shoes, we will never know their feelings, psychological, mental, and physical state unless we were truly in their place. So, I want to end with a question for you. If you were in their place, do you think you would have been able to do what they did? Would you have been able to eat your companion's flesh? And with that, we come to the end of the video. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please do so and activate the notification bell. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.